Hello, everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. As always, I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and today we are talking about social media policies. Originally intended as a way of outlining standard operating procedures and defining proper employee conduct on the web in order to protect the company and the brand, today's social media policies go beyond protection to actually encourage employees to share positive messaging about the company online, sometimes even on their own personal accounts. Joining us today is Bob Oberstein. Bob has worked on both sides of the labor relations table, both in the private and public sectors, for 48 years. As an educator, he developed and administered the Labor Management Relations program at Ottawa University, and he is now resurrecting his practice as an arbitrator, mediator, facilitator, and investigator. As a lifelong learner, he recently graduated with a Master's of Jurisprudence in Labor and Employment Law from Tulane University's School of Law. Bob, we are so glad you're here to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today because I do feel like social media has changed so much in the last decade or so. It's become such an important part of our corporate strategies. And for many, obviously, it's become an even more important part of their personal lives. And when you get those two intertwined, lines can easily get crossed. So I'm glad you're here to help us update our view on social media policies. So we'll just dive right in. This episode assumes that most of our listeners currently have some sort of social media policy in place. For those few who might not have hopped on this train yet, what are corporate social media policies and why are they so important?
Well, I think it's interesting the way the question's been posed because I've been trying to think of who hasn't had to hop on this train yet. Most organizations have a corporate social media policy, but I like the fact that you made it plural because it affects more than just the social media policy. If you have a discipline policy, it has to coordinate with your social media policy. If you have a policy on honesty or on intellectual property, those policies as well have to coordinate and be a part of your social media policy outlook and part of the education for employees. So it's more than just one policy. Having a social media policy or other policies that restrict what I'm going to refer to as Section 7 rights, meaning anyone's right, an employee's right under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act to organize and act in concert. Any policy you have that says, well, employees can't do that or can't talk about that, if it deals with wages, hours, and working conditions, they can, whether it's on social media or not. So this takes a great deal of foresight and coordination.
Why do you think that corporate social media policies are so important to the workplace?
It's where we live now.
Right.
People are constantly working. I know of no exceptions to what I'm about to say, which is people are telling me that, and this is family as well as friends and colleagues, that they are working harder at home now because the clock never stops. You don't
there's no
punch
quitting
out.
time. Yeah.
Exactly. Of course, for those of us who are OCD, and I'll include myself in that.
We're control freaks. I'll include myself in that.
Yeah, there you go. The brain never stops. 3 o'clock in
Yeah.
the morning, we're thinking about the meeting at 9 a.m. So, but this has really brought this working condition, if you will, to the fore, because the demarcation, the separation between home, personal life, and work and business has become very fuzzy.
Now, going back to social media, so just to clarify, when we say social media in 2020, what are we talking about exactly? Is it just Facebook and Twitter, or do blogs count too?
I think it's easier to define it as what it's not.
I love that.
It's not face-to-face communication, person to person in the room or across the street or that kind of thing. It's anything that is not that and is via electronic devices. So that means email as well.
Oh, you would put email in there.
Oh,
Never
absolutely.
thought of it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, well,
Social media.
take a look at the dating sites. Not that I would know this, but I've read a lot.
Sure.
Um, but you start out with just a message or two back and forth, and then it graduates to emails offline. So there's a communication there. That's a form of social media. It's the kind of thing where if I have to reach for a keyboard or a device, I'm engaged in social media.
Interesting. Okay. So, in the introduction, we touched on the fact that social media policies used to be about putting restrictions on what an employee can say, do, or post online about the company. But in the time since many of these plans were put into place, companies have come to understand what a powerful tool social media can be in recruitment, marketing, and in building the brand in a positive way. Is this shift in thinking a reason to update your policies?
The short answer is yes, but not for just those reasons. We live in a rapidly changing world, and that was even before COVID-19. Policies should always be reviewed on a regular basis. Now, many organizations that I'm familiar with have a 3 to 5 year window, if at all. Some of them don't have any window within which they review a policy. But frankly, that was the old normal. Based on recent events, I'm leaning to reduce timelines of probably no more than every 2 years for all policies on a rotating basis.
Well, let's talk a little about the development of employee brand ambassadors, employees who are encouraged to promote their workplace on social media. Has that forced a change in the social media policy landscape, in your opinion?
I guess the answer is, for some who weren't keeping up with that possibility, the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
For those who've been maintaining it and kind of thinking of worst case scenarios, probably not in those cases.
What other changes have impacted the way we look at social media policies?
Oh goodness. Well, the most glaring change is obviously what I've mentioned already, which is COVID-19,
Yeah.
because now we have an extraordinary amount of work being done via social media of all kinds. Prior to that, I would have had to have said that the biggest change was in the National Labor Relations Act and union organizing efforts via social media. I need to be clear here. That doesn't have to be necessarily by a union approaching people through social media, but I'm talking here about employee to employee conversations because that is also protected activity under the Act. And the fact is, the laws have not changed. It's just the medium that's changed.
Mhm.
But it's big because a lot of companies, if you picked up their policy today, would say employees are not supposed to be discourteous to each other, or employees must always make sure that they hold certain information as confidential. Well, that's not necessarily true when it's employee to employee conversations under Section 7. We bring people on board and we teach them a lot about Title VII and sexual harassment and other kinds of discrimination. We have no trouble telling them what the law is. But when it comes to their rights under other laws, such as the National Labor Relations Act, we don't want to let them know what their rights are. And that creates a problem later on down the road because who comes in and tells them their rights? Too often, it's the union, and now management is playing catch up. So you didn't ask for my advice on this, but I'm going to give it anyway. It's best to tell employees about what all their obligations and all your obligations as the employer are up front, right away, so everybody knows. And to this extent, a good social media policy under the National Labor Relations Act, the National Labor Relations Board has actually issued memos and letters on this. It's a policy that gives good, clear examples of what is permissible and what is not permissible.
I think that's always preferred anyway, so there's no gray, there's no question.
In the immediate knowledge base, that's true. There's
Sure.
always going to be something that you didn't think of, but
Well, yeah.
absolutely, you need to make it as clear in as many different ways as possible.
Mhm.
And of course, that means letting people know what's also permissible, and that means letting people know what their rights are, as well as what they shouldn't be doing. And for some reason, organizations have been very reluctant to do that. But I think that's a change that's going to have to be made, especially with the increased use of social media.
Yeah, you're right. All right, Bob, right now we're going to take a sponsorship break, but when we get back, we'll learn what should be included in an effective corporate social media policy. So stay with us. Thanks to this week's Project HR sponsor, LaborWise Leadership. LaborWise Leadership provides your frontline leaders with the knowledge they need to help you avoid third-party interference in your business. With this powerful online course, you'll teach your leaders how to create greater engagement while remaining union-free. Get your free trial at projectionsinc.com/LaborWise. We're back with arbitrator, mediator, facilitator, and investigator, Bob Oberstein. All right, so Bob, in your opinion, what are some best practice elements of any good social media policy?
There are many, but I want to emphasize two things primarily. And we've actually already touched on one of them. Whenever, wherever possible, you need to use clear and illustrative examples. And second, make sure that all the policies mesh correctly, like a well-oiled machine. You can't have one without the other and have an effective policy. Since social media is so new, if I was brought in to give my 2 cents to a group of people, I would suggest that they, when looking at their social media policy, they hold it up right next to each and every one of their other policies, just to make sure that they're not stepping on their over their own feet and tripping themselves up.
Right. I would imagine that alignment would be key here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There is a third thing which we can get into, which is training. Because if, and I think this goes for everybody, in the old days, you wrote home and said, "Hey, mom, I got the job." Today, you get on your phone and you text your family and your followers and everything. I mean, I must get a notification, several notifications every day on LinkedIn, congratulate this or that person on getting a new job as. Well, some people might want to take and put the company logo on their signature on their personal social media, whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, or whatever. And sometimes that happens automatically. But that brings with it obligations and responsibilities because you're now that ambassador for that organization.
Yeah. And whatever you say on that platform, you're reflecting back to that organization too. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's a very thin line if I watch what I say on those official professional platforms and then on my Facebook platform, which supposedly may be personal, I'm going to diss the company or my boss or someone else. Whereas the connection with my name alone is pretty obvious.
I would imagine that some of what we're talking about today, to some degree, has to do with cybersecurity. Can a well thought out social media policy protect a company from cyber attacks?
So I want to be clear here. I'm not a cybersecurity expert.
Nor am I.
Yeah, but as part of training from an employer's cybersecurity team, there are measures and monitoring that employees can be trained and sensitized to. Periodically, my last employer, we were required to go through training online, which emphasized many things, which were just good practices. I don't think you can be serious about social media without actually employing the skills of cybersecurity experts.
Sure. What role do these policies that we've been discussing play in things like protecting copyrights and trade secrets?
Copyrights, there's two kinds. There's the organization's copyrights, and then there are the copyrights of others with whom the organization is in business with or doing business with. And the same would be true of trade secrets. And this is where, if you have policies on copyrights and trade secrets, this is one of those meshing situations where it has to mesh with your social media policy. So I might work for a utility and I'm one of these energy efficiency experts, and I go into, let's say, a marijuana grow operation, if it happens to be legal in that state. And in order for me to help them with their energy costs, I need to know some things, and I'm going to be told some things that are going to require a non disclosure agreement, an
Hmm.
NDA. Can I now talk on social media about this work situation? I can probably discuss certain things with my boss because they're part and party to the NDA that I would have signed. But outside of that, my discussions on their trade secrets or any copyrights they might have need to be kept in strictest confidence. And that needs to be emphasized in the social media policy. Where I see copyrights violated the most are in PowerPoints.
Really?
People are using art and pictures that it will say right on the bottom that
Oh,
this is copyrighted.
should we include PowerPoints in social media policies? Because I wouldn't have thought that that would have fallen under that heading, but I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit or anything else like it.
Not just PowerPoints, but also on YouTube. And I'm thinking here of a situation where an organization created a PowerPoint and used it on YouTube,
Oh,
and then put it out there for the public to explain what it was doing with a particular project.
wow.
But it could even be internal, because your question also went to protecting copyrights and trade secrets.
Hmm.
If I'm a fan of, let's say, Winnie the Pooh, and everything in my office is Winnie the Pooh, well, that's no problem because I purchased all of it at Disney World. But now I've got a picture of Winnie the Pooh on my sign off under my signature,
Right.
and people do this, and now it's out there. So is that unfair use of that copyrighted cartoon?
Wow. I This is just bewildering because I, like most people who are probably listening to this, would just not think about it. You know, that's your favorite cartoon or that's your favorite photographer. So, of course, you want to include their visuals to help bring to life your vision. But you're right, that falls under a copyright, a protected copyright.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's actually perfect for my next question. I wanted to ask you about takedown protocols. So, in your opinion, would outlining takedown protocols be a part of this social media policy?
Simple answer, absolutely. Takedown protocols need to be clearly stated in any social media policy, because the organization is responsible for what's out there, and they can be held liable. Part of that responsibility is that they monitor, and that doesn't mean monitoring once a week. That means 24/7.
Yeah.
They need to have something in place where they're monitoring not just what employees put on their social media, but customers as well, or members of the public. And the takedown policy has to be followed again with clarity, examples, and consistency of its decisions, because you can't make exceptions. You've got to be consistent and treat everybody the same. Again, a good example of this might be on the company's social media policy, and this would happen probably more in the public sector, but you have employees who are also consumers, whether it's a utility or a police department or some other public service organization. And they decide that they're going to talk about how they're mistreated, or how there's something about their wages, hours, or working conditions that they're dissatisfied with on this social media website of the organization. Can they do that as citizens? Can they do that as employees? There's a lot of legality in those two questions, and we don't
Yeah.
have time to get into all of it. And frankly, I'm not that qualified to comment on all of those legalities. But I think it's important that when it comes to takedown policies, organizations have them and be very sensitive to the fact that they have to
Yeah.
be consistent. Additionally, you need to have a takedown team,
Yeah.
and the team must include not just who's ever responsible for that policy, but also the legal or law department.
Bob, how specific can you get with your policy? Is an employer restricted to telling an employee what they can't talk about? Or are they permitted to tell them what they can talk about or even tell them what to say? What do you think about that?
I think the answer is both are equally important. You don't want to leave anything open-ended. You can tell me what I can't say, but maybe you also need to tell me what I can say, just so that we're on the same page. And this is where specific examples, which we've talked about earlier, come into play. And most important with Section 7 rights under the National Labor Relations Act. And it should also be part of any training and especially onboarding from day one. We've already talked about employers teaching people about Title 7 and OSHA and what other obligations are. So we shouldn't be contradictory. We should let employees know, because how can you set someone upon a path and then attempt to trip them? If we're going to tell employees what the expectation is, we have an obligation, morally or otherwise, to let them know where the rocks and the twigs are that they might trip over.
Yeah. Okay, so in your experience, can they tell them specifically what to say?
I think from a customer service standpoint, the answer is yes, most definitely. It's not unusual to have scripted responses, particularly at the lower levels of customer service. And so letting people know that is perfectly appropriate and the responsible thing to do. But there may be a lot of gray areas. And so this is where trying to think of and having as many examples as possible in a policy can be very helpful. Yeah, if you think about when somebody is a brand ambassador, and if they're using their own personal account in that capacity, the question is, can they say whatever they would like, or do they need a canned or scripted response or certain parameters? And the answer is, because they're representing the organization, they need to respond in a way that is within the organization's approval. And that could be pre-approved or it could be general guidelines, but it's perfectly permissible for an organization to state what the expectations are. It doesn't hurt that those expectations are spelled out in a social media policy, and if it's someone's job, certainly in their job description as well.
Is this where disclosure of employee status comes in?
Absolutely. What you're really talking about, I think, is endorsements, whether they're positive or negative endorsements, the product or service from the company or something related to the company. I think the news media is a good example of this. Sometimes NPR or 60 Minutes will be reporting on something. And one of the first things you will hear is that they are affiliated with the situation or organization they're about to comment on because this person is one of their sponsors, and that the party listening or viewing the media is aware of this connection, and that it is something for them to consider in evaluating what they're about to hear or see.
So we've talked a lot about some restrictions of editing social media with these policies. Do you think that social media policies infringe on an employee's right to free speech?
Well, it can be if we're talking about Section 7 and those rights, clearly, but it also depends if you're private or public as an employer. Since a public employer, everything that you do as a public employee is now public record. Aside from that, public employers in general have to uphold free speech and privacy rights as part of its mandate. Private employers, not so much. They have the freedom to restrict certain types of speech. However, what's important here for either is what we call expectation of privacy. And these need to be not only clearly stated in a policy as discussed, but consistently practiced. And many organizations, when you sign on in the morning onto your computer, it will have these expectations stated in the sign on procedures. But that raises the question, is that enough? Since it becomes automatic and loses significance to the user, who over time merely glosses over it.
Mhm.
or checks the box to get to the next screen. So you have to show as an employer that you're constantly reinforcing the level of expectation when it comes to privacy. This also gets into the area of public relations privacy, such as a photograph. Sometimes people will put a photograph of somebody that they know, or an organization will put a photograph of happy customers at a picnic, but they won't get permission. And this
Yeah.
is something that is state by state. So an organization needs to be very, very careful. The formal term is right to publicity. And here in the state of Washington, you don't have to be a celebrity to have that right to publicity.
Oh,
So if
yeah.
someone uses my picture on social media and there's been some gain, now there's a great possibility that they have violated my right to publicity. So I need to be sensitive about that as an employer. The question was, infringement on employees' right to free speech. The potential is great. So we've got to be very careful in moving forward that everyone is educated as to what those rights are and what the policy says. And this is where that takedown committee
Sure.
also has to become very active and be very knowledgeable, because they're not just there to protect the organization and its product, they're there to also protect the organization from violating the law.
Sure. Okay, so I know we've already touched on this a little bit, but can a company really compel an employee to use their personal social media networks for business purposes? I'd love to just go a little bit deeper into that.
Well, and I have worked for an organization. It was a public organization where I got a stipend each month for using my own personal cell phone. What I was told, though, at the time, I didn't have a problem with this, but this is before texting was as popular as it is now. And what I was told at the time was, oh, by the way, if you do, then everything on your cell phone will now become subject to discovery.
Wow. So they can
Uh,
monitor really anything you do on it.
yeah, well, especially if there's a lawsuit.
Sure, sure, sure.
That made me, I was comfortable with it then, but as texting became more popular and as I learned more about this, I now opt for two phones. As an employee, you don't want to mix the two. I know it's inconvenient, but it's probably not a good idea because it creates too much gray regarding ownership of the account, obligations, and policies. And who really owns that account now?
Right.
Is it mine?
Yeah,
Or, I mean, it's on my phone or it's on my computer, it's my Facebook account, but is it really mine? Especially if I'm involved in sales and now I'm going someplace else, but those people are following me.
sure.
You see, there's a business value to a social media account. So employers need to make sure that their ownership is spelled out in a binding document, preferably signed, establishing who owns what when it comes to social media accounts.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Well, Bob, it's time now for a very quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and our guest today is arbitrator, mediator, facilitator, and investigator Bob Oberstein. So, Bob, once you have your social media policy put together, the next step is communicating it. What's the best way to communicate it to your employees? And is communication enough? Or do employees need to be trained in the policy?
Well, I think you need to train them from day one and then keep right on training them. And in between, communicating as often as possible. Some organizations will send out an email saying, oh, by the way, we've changed this policy and the updated policy is attached. In my opinion, not enough, because this is a tool they're going to be using every day. And they may not get to read that dated policy until later on. And even if you highlight what the updates are, this is something that is going to become more and more of a tool as we go forward. And so letting them know from day one And I mean that seriously, as part of the very first day on the job, before they even sit down at their desks or get the company cell phone or get the company iPad or laptop, they're going to be associating or affiliating through their own social media accounts almost immediately before any of that happens with friends and family. So it's important they understand the rules as soon as possible. Frankly, it wouldn't hurt when you send them the letter saying welcome. You've passed your background check and you'll be starting on this day or that day. Right then and there should be a copy of the social media policy, or at least some version of it where it is quick and easy to understand, but
Yeah,
they get
in
the
writing.
idea.
Yeah,
Exactly.
definitely.
A lot of these social media policies have a separate sign off. That might be a good time to make them familiar with it from day one. I mean, if this is supposed to be so important, it needs to be treated as very important.
Mhm.
And letting somebody know right at the outset when you have their attention before they come on board is always a good thing.
I agree. The more clear you are in communication, I mean, the less gray area you're going to have in all situations, work or personal.
True, and it's not just the training. The periodic retraining and the communication has to be ongoing,
Yeah.
almost like daily vitamins that you take, because lax behavior, bad habits can be corrected, and memories can be refreshed, and more importantly, should it be needed in the future, the employer will have a training record to demonstrate that the employee had been trained and knew better.
Okay, shifting topics here, Bob. You've mentioned that you're returning to your previous neutral practice. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. In the immediate future, I'm going to be available as an investigator, a neutral investigator, as well as a mediator and arbitrator, trainer, and educator. And these are things I did primarily when I was teaching at the university level. The plan is to get back to that and make myself available to the parties. Many of my mediations involve complex situations in not just labor and management, but in construction and commercial disputes, as well as in the financial industry and a number of other industries. And many of my arbitration decisions, a number of them have been published for use by other arbitrators as well. I can be reached through LinkedIn, or my personal email will suffice, which is capital B, capital O, BERSTEIN at AOL.com. I'm going to be there and happy to be available and of help to any and all parties.
Wonderful. Well, as always, listeners, this contact information will be included in this episode's companion guide as well. So take a moment and sign up for it today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Bob, it's time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
No, but go ahead anyway.
It's a great answer. All right, topic showdown. In this episode, we discussed social media policies, but managed to make it all the way to the lightning round without mentioning a single emoji. But of course, we're going to ruin it all at the end. So Bob, in your opinion, which emoji do you prefer? The classic smiley face or the laughing so hard I'm crying face?
Well, I'm surprised it's just limited to those two choices because my reputation is that of the emoji king.
Really? Take your emoji,
yes.
Bob.
Well, I use as many of them as I can and I try and stay as varied as I can, especially when texting, so as to replace facial expressions or voice inflections, because communication is an art. And I don't know about anyone else, but I need all the color of the Crayolas I can to make sure my message is being heard the way I intended.
I love that. We've got to express ourselves, right? I'm so glad we have emojis to do so.
Oh, absolutely.
What's the worst job interview question you've ever been asked?
Well, certainly the strangest, if not the worst. This was back in 1978, and it was my second interview for my very first labor relations job. And I was asked by the person I would be working for if I would report him to the EEOC. It was a very odd question.
Yeah, strange.
And very strange, and it was very unusual.
It certainly is. What's your favorite thing about working in labor and employment law?
So overall, you never know what the weather's going to be. There's never been 2 days that were exactly the same. And as one of my mentors said, and I hope it's okay to say it, and I'm quoting here, it's the most fun you can legally have with all of your clothes on.
All right. Yeah, that works. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
If somebody is trying to help you, get out of their way and let them.
Oh, I like that. That's great. Who or what inspires you?
Oh my. I would have to say, especially with what's going on today with COVID and the protests and everything, on a very visceral level, it's watching people exert the goodness within them.
I agree. That's moving me too. Well, Bob, thanks for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Mine too. And thanks to our listeners. And as always, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, we hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply rate us 5 stars wherever you get your content. Well, that's it for me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.